normal class participants are here. I know I have heard from a couple of students who normally participate that they won't be able to make it this today. And I think for those of you who are teaching, maybe your classes and things are starting to ramp up again for August. I know maybe preparing classrooms or having meetings at school. So I know that it will begin to be a busy time. But I am definitely glad to have you two here, and we will go ahead and get started. I think that with the smaller class, we'll probably have a little bit more time for some practice at the end. Okay, and so last week we began our discussion on interrupting. And we introduced that topic by going through a few situations where it is appropriate to interrupt during a conversation. Vicky or Claire, do either one of you just know a few of those? That do you remember a few of those times when it's appropriate to interrupt?
If you want to do some clarification,
Yep. Yep, exactly. That's definitely one of the big reasons why we want to interrupt if we need to do some clarification. Any other reasons why we might interrupt?
you would like to join or participated in a meeting and to share your ideas or opinion before it moves on to the next topic.
Yes, yes, that is very good. So, perfect. You want to add your opinion or something to the topic before you move on, because of course, if the topic moves on to something else, it may be an even worse time to try to add something to the discussion, especially if we've already moved on and we're no longer talking about that. That could actually be more disruptive to the meeting than just asking at that time. So, absolutely. Now, those are probably our two biggest reasons why most of the times we will interrupt. And now we will learn a little bit more about when and how to interrupt. So, let's move forward, and I will just change my view here. My apologies, my Skype is moving rather slowly, so it's just taking a while to get the options, but I hopefully this will speed up a little bit. But it is having some issues here. Okay. Hopefully this will start sharing. Okay. Can you all see the screen and me in it? Okay. And the all of the things on the screen here. I think it's visible. Okay. Good. So let's start with when and how to interrupt. Okay. So very quickly, we have some things here, especially about the how to interrupt. So we just reviewed our wins. So when we have information to add, maybe we need to ask for clarification. These are good times or good reasons why we need to interrupt. Now going on to when and how. So the first couple of bullet points here are actually things that we should do before the meeting to help us if we need to interrupt. So these aren't things that we do while interrupting. These are actually the first two bullet points are actually things that we can do before. So the first thing I have here is to come prepared to the meeting. And what I mean by that is if you have received an agenda or you have received at least a brief summary of what the meeting will cover, you can already come to the meeting with maybe two or three questions that you know you have about the topic. So maybe these are things that you want to know or information that you want to provide about a topic. So maybe it's not a question that you write. Maybe you write yourself a note just to say, I need to make sure that I add this topic or I add this point when we talk about this item on the agenda. Coming prepared to the meeting will just with those types of questions will then help you as you go through. You'll know when you may need to interrupt, and you can start to time and feel when is most appropriate in that section of the agenda. So having a few things prepared ahead of time is always a good idea. Second is to practice active listening. Do either of you two know what active listening is, or have you heard of that term before? Active listening? Oh, Claire, if you look like you were saying something, but you were still muted. Maybe not. Okay. Well, active listening is when we turn listening, because listening is very passive usually. So passive is something that we just do without having to do anything, without having to really think about it, is a passive style. So listening can be very passive. If I just sit here, I can hear things happening around me. I can hear discussions happening, but that doesn't mean that I'm actively listening. So think of passive listening as if you have a TV on in the background and you are having a conversation with a child, with your child, maybe your spouse, maybe a friend, and so you're talking to your friend, but you can still hear the TV in the background. That's sort of a passive listening where you can hear the things, but you're not actually paying attention to what's going on. So when we say that we want to practice active listening, this is when we have full engagement with what the speaker is saying. So, active listening involves more than just hearing what is said, it's really focusing on the speaker. It's making eye contact with the speaker. It is reacting to things, showing that you're engaged. This is what we do when we actively listen to something. And so, when we think of interruptions, we it will make our interruption much more valuable if we have been actively listening. Because if we're actively listening, we're going to hear all of the details, we're going to hear all of the explanations. Because the one thing we don't want to do when we interrupt is to interrupt with something that doesn't really add any value, or to interrupt with something that has already been explained before, because now we're stopping the meeting and we don't really have a good reason to. Also, active listening will help you monitor for some of these things that we're going to talk about, especially waiting for a pause or a natural break or transition. So, excuse me, when you are actively listening, you're really engaged with the speaker. You have eye contact, you're paying attention. And so, therefore, you can hear when the speaker makes a pause. You can hear when the speaker maybe takes a breath. So maybe they've said a long sentence or given a lot of facts and they pause to breathe. Maybe there's a natural break or transition that already occurs. So this is when we're listening for key words like, okay, and so moving on to the next topic, or we're listening to those when we spoke in a previous class about phrases that we can use during a meeting to keep our meeting on track. This is when you're listening for some of those transitional phrases and phrases that we're going to move to another topic. But if you're not actively listening and you're just hearing things in the background or not paying attention, you may miss some of those cues. And so that's what we want to make sure we're paying attention for. All right. And then one of the other suggestions from the homework that you all saw was to use a gesture. So we always have things like raising our hands, making that eye contact and raising an eyebrow, maybe leaning in a little bit so that someone knows, oh, I just want to I just want to ask a question. These are the gestures that we can use. And then lastly, a concept of building on or bridging. And so this really speaks to how we interrupt someone and what we can do to make our interruptions more polite and more meaningful to both the speaker and our audience. And so I want to talk just a little bit more about that. So when we build or bridge, it's when we either use a compliment and add to what the speaker said, which is the building, or we state a connection between their message and what we want to say or our comment, which is when we build a bridge. So we're either going to build onto what they're talking about or we're going to connect it to what we're talking about. And one of the key ways that we can do that for building is giving a compliment, and we can actually say, let me build on that. So let's say that Steve was speaking in a meeting and we wanted to interrupt. We could start off by using one of our phrases that we're going to learn in just a second, but we can also add, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you brought that up, Steve. Or I'm glad Steve brought that up if you're talking to the group as a whole. This is a way to give credit to the speaker to show that you appreciate what they're saying and that you just want to add something on. Or, like a second example, let me build on what Steve said. So, this is also a way that you are giving credit to the speaker and the importance of what they've said, but that you're going to build onto it. The other way here that we have as far as a bridge goes is when we connect what the speaker is saying to what we want to say. And there's many ways that you can do this, but I have an example here where we could say something like, your explanation of this issue and how it impacts our operation sounds very similar to something I encountered recently. And then you could add on to what you encountered. So again, this is another way to give some credit to what has already been said while you connect it to what your interruption is about. So it just gives you a little more value in your interruption, and it makes the other person feel valued and feel appreciated because you've taken the time to do that. Any questions about these first few hows and whens? Or how we can build a bridge or build onto what the speaker said. Okay, well, let's keep going. All right. So the next section that I'm going to go into will go over a lot of phrases that we can use to politely interrupt. And so for these, now, when we use a phrase, all of these phrases to interrupt, we're going to start with some that will kind of be what you will use to start your interruption. And then there are some other phrases that we can use as a part of what we're saying in an interruption. So, a couple of key things to note is that we always want to speak politely and start our conversation with a polite introduction to our interruption. So that's what we're going to talk about first is how do we start our interruption with a polite phrase or to begin the interruption. But then also, like it was mentioned in the video, we want to make sure that our tone is also appropriate to address and interrupt with a polite tone in our voices so that people know that we don't mean to be disrespectful or we don't mean to be rude, but we just have something to add or need clarification. Um, and then, of course, how you interrupt or the phrase that you use for interruptions it depends a lot on the situation. And I will talk about some of the ones that we can use for a lot of different reasons and ones that maybe are more specific to a certain situation. And of course, and one other bullet point that I have here that I will go through is that interrupting, like a lot of our other phrases when we're talking about a meeting, there are some formality issues. So some phrases are definitely better used in a group of people that you know very well, maybe your peers, maybe with friends. And then some things are going to be more formal that you would use in a business meeting or a meeting with maybe department heads or someone who you report to, someone that we want to show a higher deal of respect to in that regard. So formality is also something that we'll keep in mind. And then lastly, we will also keep in mind that some of these phrases, even though they may be asked as a question, sometimes those questions are rhetorical in that they don't require a response. Sometimes when we interrupt, we're going to use a phrase in the form of a question, but that doesn't mean that we're actually needing a response. We may not actually need them to give us a response. We can just start our interruption. So that's something else we'll pay attention to as we go through some of these. All right. So let's first start with what we say when we need to interrupt. So that's our first category. What we can say when we need to interrupt. Now let me see how that looks. Okay, maybe not the most visible, but okay. So let's start with the first one here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but okay. I don't mean to interrupt, but and so all of these, whenever we see the but and a dot, 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 that's just where you would continue your phrase. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you clarify what you said? I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but would it be possible to go over point number two again? And so these are ways that we can kind of we can interject ourselves into the speaker and into when the speaker is talking. And we want to use those keys like gesturing maybe with a hand, waiting for that pause or a natural break whenever possible. We still want to do that. All right. How about Vicky? Do you want to read the rest of column number one, the left side column?
I'm sorry here, or
Oh, start with excuse me for interrupting. Yep.
okay. Stop me for interrupting. But can I just? Is this one?
Yeah, and you don't have to continue the sentence. This is just how you would start your phrase, and
Okay.
then you would continue it depending on what you needed to say.
Uh, so should I continue this one
Yeah.
or make a new? Okay.
Oh, just start with the next bullet. So you can just read
Okay.
the bullets
Okay.
as they are on the sheet. Yep.
Okay. The next one is let me interrupt a second.
Mhm.
And the next one, excuse me for butting in, but
Yes. Now, so let's stop with this right here. in in order the way that we're using these here, most of these are pretty neutral in when you would use them, whether in a more formal or less formal occasion. Most of these would work. Now I'm going to tell you a few clues to what we could do if this was a truly formal situation. So one thing that we can do is instead of saying, I'm sorry to interrupt, we could change that to my apologies, but I need to interrupt. And so using my apologies instead of I'm sorry is just a way that we can make the formality kind of a one step higher to use my apologies to interrupt. So we could just say my apologies to interrupt, but or my apologies for interrupting, but okay. Another trick that we can use for formality purposes is that instead of saying excuse me for interrupting, we can use pardon me for interrupting. So rather than saying excuse me, we could step that up a level to use pardon me. So my apologies and pardon me are ways to add a little more formality to I'm sorry and excuse me. Lastly, on the first column, I want to talk about the last one here. Excuse me for butting in. This one is while it is not it's not it's not disrespectful to use butting in, but this is definitely one that you should only use in a more informal setting. You would not want to use this phrase in more formal settings just because of the word that we're using for butting in. And again, this is not it's not something that you shouldn't say, or it's not something that will show disrespect or rudeness to someone. It is a very common phrase, excuse me for butting in, but it's just the least formal of all of these. That is the least formal. And so you definitely would want to reserve that for informal occasions. Okay. Now, next, I'm going to look at in the second column, there are some questions here, and these are ones that are in the form of a question, and it just depends in these cases. It just depends on the situation and how the meeting atmosphere and the environment goes. If you want to ask the question and wait for a response, or just ask the question and continue talking. So this column will be a little bit different than some of the ones that we talk about in future slides, because these sometimes we do wait for a response. So if I were in a meeting and I said, "Can I stop you there for a moment?" I might wait for a response, because this might be a situation where the speaker is talking and I really want to cut in. I do want to ask for permission, like, "Oh, can I just stop you right there for a moment?" And the speaker might say, "Oh, just let me finish this thought and then I'll come right back to you." Or they might say, "Sure, sure, go ahead. What is your question or what is your concern?" And so this column are times where we might wait for a response. Now, if the meeting is more informal, or if the environment of the meeting is kind of more free flowing with ideas, maybe this is a brainstorming meeting, so there's an expectation that we're going to be exchanging ideas freely, then you may just say this question and continue talking. "Can I just stop you there for a moment? I wanted to add a point." You might just do that. So this is going to be a case by case basis on whether you would wait to get a response or not. Definitely in more formal meetings, you may wait to get a response to these initial questions here. So some other variations of those same ones. Can I just mention something? Or can I just butt in for a second? Similarly, similar to when we used "excuse me for butting in," we also only want to use "can I just butt in a second" in informal situations. We would not want to use that one in a formal setting. So keep that in mind. All right. So any questions so far about using these phrases to interrupt or to start your interruption? Go ahead.
So when teachers is teaching, so we can use the same way to interrupt teacher.
Yeah. Yes, yes, yes. These are all fine. And so yes, absolutely. So when we're having these types of teaching sessions, or even in the classroom, it really is kind of like a meeting. It's almost like we're having a meeting, and I'm the presenter of the meeting. And so these are all ways that you could also interrupt in those cases. And I would say in a classroom setting is probably a time when you definitely will expect to have interruptions, because we want the students to be interactive. We want the students to ask, to get clarification on things. We expect that a person may have a question or need clarification. And so, yes, all of these phrases work in an academic setting as well.
Okay, thank
Now,
you.
maybe not butt in. Maybe we would save butt in for our friends. Maybe not so much for a teacher. And it definitely, if you were a younger student speaking to an adult teacher, you may not say butt in or can I butt in for a second? Probably not appropriate in that way. But definitely between adults, in this kind of a setting, yeah, that's something that would be all right. Mhm.
Thank you.
Any other? Oh yeah, no worries. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So next, let's talk about adding information. So that is another reason why we often interrupt in a meeting because we have valuable information that we want to give to the speaker or to the rest of the meeting, the rest of the people in the meeting. And so in this case, these are all, now we just went over ways that we can start our interruption. So phrases that we could use at the very beginning when we first speak to interrupt. These phrases are ones that you could add on to those other phrases, the ones that we just used. So, excuse me for interrupting, but I need to add something here. Pardon me for interrupting. May I add? So these are ways that you could start the next part of your interruption. So we had the way that we initially state our that we're going to interrupt. We had those phrases. And now these are ones that you can add depending on the situation. So here we're talking about adding information. So these are ways that you could start with that first phrase and then go right into this next one. So I need to add something here. May I add? I'd like to add. Let me add something. That reminds me. And then can I just say something here? And now I've put in parentheses here for the last bullet that this is a situation where typically you will not wait for a response. So if you were using, let's say, can I just say something here? Even though that's a question, there's no need to wait for a response this time. And so an example of that would be, let's say if I said, excuse me for interrupting. Can I just add something here? I think it's a really great idea that we look to other options for our factory. So that's an example. You might put a small pause after, but the pause does not need to be long enough to wait for a response. So if you notice how I did that, excuse me, excuse me for interrupting. Can I just add something here? I really love the way you explained that last segment. Thank you. So we just want to use maybe a small pause just to separate the question from what our actual interruption is, but not long enough where we're actually waiting for someone to accept that we're going to say something. Okay. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, too, when we use these phrases to add something to a discussion, just make sure that it is something that we're adding something that is related to or adds value to what the speaker is talking about. So this goes to our first tips that we were talking about in the how to interrupt and when to interrupt. We want to make sure that we're either building on to what the speaker is saying or we connect it with a bridge to what the speaker is saying. But in either case, we always want what the speaker is saying to be the focus, and then we add our information on top, or we connect the information that we are giving to what the speaker already said. And so that's very important whenever we're adding information, is that we don't want to because when we interrupt, we never want the speaker to feel like we are taking over the meeting, or that we're a phrase that we often will say is that we're stealing someone's thunder. So stealing someone's thunder, taking the spotlight off of them and putting it onto yourself, is what that phrase means, to steal someone's thunder. We don't want the speaker to feel like that, and we don't want if even if they are even if we have something valuable to add, or we think that there's a necessary piece of information that maybe they missed, we still don't want them to walk away, or to after that transaction, or after that interaction, I should say, after that interaction, we don't want them to feel like they've been disrespected or rude, or that we've been rude to them. And that's a good way that we can do it, to make sure that we connect to, or definitely state that we're building onto what the speaker said. All right. Any questions there? Yes, yes, please go ahead.
If how about if I just sorry, close first. Who's going to say?
Oh, go ahead. You're going. You're going.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. How about if I just say, pardon me, may I just say something here? And suddenly someone say no. And how do I face the situation?
Oh, yes. That's a good
That's embarrassed.
yeah, that's a that's a good point. And so that is something that someone could say. I would say that usually, if we have done the other things that we want to keep in mind when interrupting. So we've been actively listening, we've waited for a pause or a natural kind of break in the conversation, and we've done our gesture, or that type of, some type of cue that we're about to come into a conversation. Typically, most it might be rare for someone to be like, no, you cannot. And I think also it's rare too, because the other person doesn't want to also feel like they're being rude to you. So you've been polite. You pardon me, may I add something here? You've done the correct things when you're interrupting. So most times people don't want to be so harsh, but if that happens, then what we have to do is we'll just accept that they don't want us to speak at that moment, because we don't want to draw focus away from the meeting at hand and the topics of the meeting. So what that could cause, if you then went back to them like, well, no, I really want to add this, and then they come back at you, now we've started a whole nother a whole nother issue, and it's taken away from our meeting. Now we've distracted the meeting, and we've gone off somewhere else to, should you interrupt, should you not? And so if you encounter a person, or you're in a meeting where someone says, "Oh, you know what? It would be better if you didn't. Let me just finish my thought." Then we'll just accept that, and we'll wait, and then come back to the question. Make sure that you come back. So then maybe after they finish their thought, or when you know that they definitely are changing topics, then you try your interruption again and say, "Oh, before you move on, I had that question before. Can we address that now?" Make sure that you do come back to it at a different time that may be better, because if they told you that, it's most likely because they are in the middle of a thought, and they don't want to distract from where they're going. They're kind of on a track, and they don't want to deviate just yet. But if you wait just a little bit longer to a different moment in the conversation or in the discussion, they should let you in and let you interrupt at that point. So try that if that happens. But I can say, I mean, not that I've been in hundreds of meetings or thousands of meetings, but I can't say that I've ever had someone necessarily really shut me down with a interruption, if I've done it appropriately, and been respectful of the time, and did it in a respectful way. Yeah. Good
Okay, thank you.
question. Yeah. Claire, did you have a question also?
Yes. I want to ask that here you say that can I just say something here? You say that it's no need to wait for a response. But in the previous sheets that say if I say can I just mention something, then maybe you need to wait for a response or permission. And what's the two differences? Or it depends on the situation.
Yeah, great question. So in the first ones, when I put those phrases there with questions, those questions were meant to be your initial kind of the start to your interruption. And so if you feel that you're in a meeting, maybe it's a very formal meeting, or maybe it's just a meeting where there isn't a lot of participation from the non-speakers or from the observers of the meeting, then maybe you do want to phrase it as a question and wait for a response to wait to see if it's a good time to interrupt. Or maybe it's a situation. So in I think our first class this summer, we talked about how we need to establish ground rules for our meeting. And one of those ground rules that we usually establish is when people should ask questions. So do you want people to ask questions throughout? Would you rather them ask their questions at the end? Or, is there a specific time where after each section of the agenda you'll stop and wait for questions? So if you're going to break one of those rules, what maybe someone said, hold off your questions until the end of the meeting, but you know that this is very important and you really do need to ask this at the time when it's happening, then you can use those questions and stop and wait for a response. The difference is in this situation, even though it's put here as a question, it's really more of a statement. And this question here is going to be something that you would normally say after you've already started your interruption. So that's why for these you might say, "Excuse me for interrupting, but can I just say something here and just continue?" It's usually not just saying, "Can I just say something here?" And if you did, then maybe you would want to wait for a response and use this phrase in that first category of how you first enter an interruption. And so on that first slide, I know it may be a little bit confusing, but on that first slide, let's go back to that really quickly, just so I can make that point clear. So if we look at this slide, on the left side, we have all of the phrases that we can use to start an interruption where we don't wait for a response. So if we know that it's the type of meeting or maybe a more informal meeting where we're allowed to just kind of ask questions as we feel we need, we're allowed to kind of have this open dialogue with our speaker, then using any of those phrases on the left would not require you to stop or to wait for them to allow it. Whereas in the right column, these are ones that you can use if it is more formal, or if you feel that even if it's an informal meeting, you feel that there isn't a lot of interaction between the participants and the speaker. And so you want to kind of be a little more polite or really just ask and wait for a response. But these are all meant to start your interruption. And the other phrases were ones that you would say after you've said one of these. Is that a little more clear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so let's move forward then to jumping in. Now, jumping in is it's really just another interruption, but we're using some different words. So maybe instead of saying pardon me for interrupting, this sort of is in the same vein as butting in, if when we say can I butt in. And so all of these are going to be ones that it's sort of that you can use also as a beginning of your interruption, just using some different phrases. And all of these, except for, well, actually, I would say half and half. So the top three are going to definitely be your more informal ways. Let me jump in. No waiting for response. Do you mind if I jump in here? Can I jump in here? These are ones that you would use similar to the first, where you were most likely going to maybe wait for a response, see if they'll let you jump in, and then continue on with your phrase. Now, the last three bullets, the fourth, fifth, and sixth bullet, these are going to be a little more formal. And we're using some different language here. So, do you mind if I come in here? Instead of jumping in, do you mind if I come in? And instead of saying can I, you are asking, do you mind if I? All right. The next one, I don't mean to be rude, but this one also is probably a little bit more on the formal side, not as formal as maybe "Do you mind if I come in?" and definitely not as formal as "May I interject?" So "May I interject" is a more formal way, but also interjecting it's just a stronger word. And so when we interject, normally we're going to say something that may be counter or may be against what the person has just said. So usually an interjection has the kind of the overall thoughts of really being something like I'm going to say something that may be either a different side of what you've just presented, or maybe it's something that is in contradiction to what you've presented. And so an interjection is more powerful, and it's definitely something that's used in a more formal a more formal setting to interject. Okay. All right. Good. So let's
May
move
I?
on now. Oh yes. Yes, go right ahead.
When we use like the very last sentence, may I interject? And what's the difference between the use of interject and interrupt?
Yeah. So an interruption, they both are essentially the same thing. They just have a different weight to them. So an interruption is a little more general. It just is meaning anytime someone is speaking and we're going to stop them from speaking to say something. That's an interruption. An interjection is also the same thing, but when we are interjecting, typically it's because we have a differing opinion or we have to offer the different side of a coin. And an interjection also are typically in situations where we may get some pushback. And by pushback, I mean that someone might disagree with what I said, or we might have to have a back and forth discussion about what I said. So interjections, they are interruptions, but interruptions with a little more, I wouldn't say force, but just that if you ask to interject, that tells the speaker that I need to be prepared for something that may be against or another side to what I'm saying. And so kind of if we think about it, all interjections are interruptions, but not all interruptions are necessarily interjections, or at least the way that we use the word. Yeah. They have very similar meanings, but just in the kind of connotation that the word has and how it's received. If you tell me, may I interject? I'm kind of I'm more prepared for what's coming versus if may I interrupt, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, what's up, but yeah, what's your question? But if you said interject, now I'm like, oh, what is she going to say? What is she? That it's just how it's received, how the speaker interprets that usually.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So,
Okay.
excuse
Oh, yes.
So that means interject is the specific purpose, but the interrupt is more general, right?
Yeah, I would say interrupt is the usage of interrupt is definitely more general. Interject is just going to be a little more serious. Let's say that. Not maybe more powerful or more forceful, but just maybe a little more serious. It has a more serious tone than an interruption. Interject just has a more serious tone. And so it's usually going to be something that you're going to say that may cause some ruffles or some a little back and forth. It's just a little more serious when you want to interject.
Okay.
Also, interject too, and it's same still the same purpose, but um well actually I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there for now. But interject, yeah, just a little more serious. It just has a little more weight to it when you say that you're going to interject. And so that's one that's definitely not used as often. It's not definitely, pardon me, may I interrupt, or excuse me for interrupting. May I jump in there? Those are definitely all much more common. Interject is a little more serious, yeah. Okay. And then another one that we've talked about, I know we're getting close to the wow. We may wrap some of these up in the next class, but just to kind of wrap up a little bit of these. So these are the clarification ones. So ones where we need more information or we don't understand something enough, so we're going to use some of these. And oh, I think I have one extra one here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that was an extra one that I put on here. My apologies for that. But let's look at these. So, could you clarify that? Very simple. Sorry. Could you explain that a little more? So again, we're going to still use one of those intro phrases for interrupting. So, pardon me for interrupting. Could you clarify that? Excuse me, or sorry to interrupt. Would you tell me a little more about that? Still going to use one of those first phrases, but then this is kind of that next part that we would say after we initially interrupt. Could you clarify that last point before we move on? So that's a good one to use too. Um, would you mind explaining that a little more? Could you explain that more fully? Now, this one, can you explain that more fully? This one is one, so when we use that phrase, it's specifically used whenever someone has maybe given a brief explanation for something, or really just maybe explain something in just a short sentence, and you want it to be a more in-depth explanation, or maybe you need all the details. Maybe they just provided you with a quick overall blurb or a quick overall sentence, but you're looking for the actual details of what they explained. So that's explaining something more fully. And then, lastly, here, that I want to point out is, do you mean that? So that is one where if you use this phrase, you want to summarize what they said. So let's say that I was going to use Vicky's last question as something I was going to want clarification about. I could say, sorry for interrupting, but do you mean that interjecting is more specific and interrupting is more general? That's a way that you would say that. So you're going to want to give a brief summary of what the speaker has just said when you ask, do you mean that? You want to kind of give back what they just told you so that then they can say, yes, that is what I meant, or no, actually I was trying to say, and move on. Okay. Now, we did still have one more section here, and we didn't quite get to it. So we will move on to more formal phrases. There's just a few, but we'll move on to more formal phrases in our next class. And also, I am so happy that Angelina brought up what if someone says no, because in our next class, we're going to flip roles. We're going to then talk about how you as a speaker handle interruptions. And so we'll go over ways that you can tell someone no if it's necessary. All right. Cool. Well, thank you all. This was a good class, and keep I for this week, just review this presentation, start getting comfortable with using some of these phrases, or at least remembering them and putting them in your repertoire. There won't be any official homework for this week, so everyone will have a little break on that, but we will come back next week with a little more on being on the other side, and then we'll work on some stuff for next week. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
See you next week.
Bye.
See you next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.